Yeah, I remember reading in Robert Sapolsky's book Behave a bunch of examples of priming, and one, for whatever reason, stuck with me, which is that if the room smells like garbage, you become more homophobic.
Yeah, there's a lot of those, and these, you can understand why a study like that will get a lot of mainstream attention and get written up in a book. It's very provocative, this idea that like smelling garbage can make you. I'm laughing because that's almost like if I were going to make up like a fake social priming experiment as like this sort of thing. But there were so many of these studies, and when you try to replicate them, when you try to run the experiment back and generate the same effect again, usually it doesn't work. Like experimental psychology on the whole has a rate of successful replication of about 50%. Social psychology tends to be much lower. And Brian Nozick, who's sort of one of the most well-regarded social psychologists around, told a journalist writing about this issue, he's not aware of any social priming phenomenon that has successfully replicated. And he's a guy who speaks very carefully. So this area of science has just been a disaster.
So the thing about these results is that they're simultaneously surprising, but also plausible. So for instance, the other two I remember off the top of my head that I've heard many people talk about are that there's some experiment where you're asked to rate the attractiveness of a man or woman on a shaky bridge or in a situation that seems dangerous, a roller coaster type situation, and you mistake your elevated heart rate and arousal for a sexual arousal. You mistake your physiological arousal for a sexual arousal, and you end up rating that person as more attractive than you would have if you had met them in another context or in a normal context. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't sound crazy. It sounds surprising enough that I would be interested in it, but there's something superficially at least plausible about it. Does that count as a priming effect too? Or, the notion that if you wear red, that people will think you're more attractive. Are those all in prime world as well?
I would say that there's like a spectrum here. So that bridge study is really famous. I actually don't remember off the top of my head if it replicated successfully. There's actually a theory underlying that, though. That is that like your body is giving you the signal that you're just sort of misinterpreting. Mm-hmm. That to me doesn't sound like a crazy or out of the blue theory. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example of the kind that to me is like really classic priming. There was a study where they showed the participants a photo of the thinker, the statue where the dude's going like this.
Yeah.
Or they showed them a photo of a statue of a guy hurling a discus. And they claimed that just looking at a statue of a guy thinking reduced people's level of religiosity by 20 points on a 100-point scale. Right. You're laughing because it makes no freaking sense. That study, there's no there theoretically. How could that effect possibly be true? And sure enough, it didn't replicate. The bridge study, I'd say, is like a hybrid because you could come up with some sort of evolutionary psychology theory of like, your body reacting away. You see someone, that doesn't strike me as crazy. The idea that looking at a statue immediately makes you less religious, I think is crazy in a different way.
I think one of the lessons of this is wherever the initial statement falls on the common sense spectrum, that's usually very close to where it lands in the final analysis, right? Like I can imagine how, say you meet someone in the context of a war zone, right? With all that drama, I can imagine how you might fall in love with them. And then when transported back to reality, you realize actually it was partly a result of the environment we were in.
Without the shells whizzing overhead, she didn't look so hot, right?
Exactly. There's something plausible about that.
Yeah.
But, the notion that you could be that affected by the particular kind of statue you're seeing, if that is true, it would imply that our minds are all the time being buffeted in fundamental ways by totally arbitrary aspects of our environment. Like the fact that I'm surrounded by taller buildings right now rather than shorter ones is changing my attitude, probably changing my politics in like fundamental ways. And it paints a picture of of how mercurial human beliefs are that doesn't align with what I know to be true from having been a human in society for a quarter century.
Yeah. And in my chapter on this stuff, I hit a book called Before You Know It by a guy named John Barge pretty hard. He's sort of one of the leaders of social priming. He makes claims like, when the weather's warm, people believe in global warming. When it's cold, they don't. And at the margin, there's some like narrow sense in which that shifts people's beliefs a little. But again, common sense and everyday experience tells us that our beliefs on global warming are connected to our politics, and they're very hard to nudge. It's obviously not the case that every snowstorm I go back to not believing in global warming, then summer. It's just what you said about common sense is true. And it actually stole an idea for a column I had that the process of psychological experimentation needs more common sense. And they've done these interesting studies where you take the results and you run them by a panel of just lay people, and you describe the finding and say, how likely do you think it is that that's true? And even just average people do better than a coin flip, telling which studies are likely to replicate. And that percentage gets higher when you run it by a panel of psychologists. So common sense is definitely lacking from a lot of these studies.
Yeah, but there's also something about that that's interesting to me, because isn't the whole point of academia to teach us things that are true, but that we don't already know as a result of common sense? So I can sort of see how isn't the incentive always to find something that goes against common sense? Or else why are we doing this whole academia thing, right? Why not just rely on our guts? So is there a conflict there between asking psychologists to accord more with common sense and asking them to do the job an academic is supposed to do?
Well, I think what's interesting about this is like common sense has historically been an enemy of science. I mean, how could light be a particle and a wave at the same time? That makes no sense. Quantum mechanics like destroys our notion of common sense. Maybe it's a matter of like how much theory is underlying a given idea. If there's no real existing theory in which looking at a statue would make you less religious, or hearing the word wrinkled would then make you walk slower, it doesn't fit into our understanding of what minds are. That's a famous social priming study that they touted as true, and then it didn't replicate. So common sense is part of it, but also like, does this fit into an underlying theory of what human minds are and what they're for and what sorts of influences we would expect to matter? But you're right. You can't just say common sense, because like the whole history of science is toppling the common sense of the era.
So let's get into why it is that this problem exists. Is it so? The first theory I'm going to put forward, which I don't believe, but I think is important to just put forward, is maybe psychologists are just not intelligent. Maybe a lack of intelligence among the people doing this research is the problem.
They should be more like podcasters, you're saying, like smart, intellectual people.
Yeah.
I think that sort of lets they should
be more like philosophy majors and podcasters.
That's true sometimes. I think it's much more complicated than that, because it's really much more about incentives and like what your university press office wants you to do with your new experiment, the seductions of a TED Talk. I don't think the academic system is a pure meritocracy, but my book is littered with people with like sterling credentials who clearly were able to achieve at high levels. I think it's much more just like this unholy alliance of sort of research institutions and pop science outlets and the TED Talk stage, because we have a lot of reasons to think that like otherwise smart people can act stupid under the right circumstances, or the wrong circumstances, perhaps.